A recently released study challenges the claim that FDR ended the Great Depression. According to this man, economist Lee E. Ohanian, and fellow researcher economist Harold L. Cole, the New Deal prolonged the Depression by approximately 7 years. In their evaluation, they sought to observe how quickly FDR's New Deal gave Americans jobs, measured in hours of work and compared to other recessions in U.S. history. What they found was that specific legislation contributed to the abnormally slow recovery that would have otherwise been much quicker had such legislation not been enacted. For instance, the National Industrial Recovery Act, passed in 1933, which exempted industries from antitrust prosecution, allowing them and encouraging them to price fix amongst themselves, so long as they also agreed to collectively raise salaries.
FDR considered the NIRA to be his most important piece of legislation, and it was certainly one of his most impacting. The NIRA established the bureaucracy known as the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, and FDR appointed General Hugh Johnson as the head of the administration. Despite the fact that many historians and defenders of FDR reject accusations that the New Deal resembled fascism, it is indisputable that NIRA was modeled after fascist economic policies. It was praised both by Hitler and Mussolini openly, and Mussolini specifically was admired by both Roosevelt and Johnson. Mussolini's system of cartels in Italy, known as cooperatives, were the basic model for the cartels established by NIRA, known as code authorities. Hugh Johnson even encouraged his employees to read a book called The Corporate State about fascist economics, which was written by an economist who also heavily influenced Mussolini.
But that's just Mussolini, right? It's not like he was a bad guy. Let's back up for a second here. A cartel in economics is defined as a group of firms that get together to cooperate on how to not compete amongst each other. They no longer have to compete for our business because they agree not to undercut each other. They agree to set output prices, production levels, transport costs, wholesale prices, retail prices down to the storefront if they can. Anything that could be used to compete amongst each other, they would instead use against the consumer. They would only raise prices on us. And this is why cartels are dangerous for a populace. It may sound like this is cooperation, and in one sense it is, but what it's doing is cooperating at the expense of the everyman. Its firms need to compete for our business that actually protects us as consumers. Removing that competition harms the economy.
NIRA essentially gave the president executive power in crafting significant regulatory legislation for every industry in America. In most cases, this meant inviting the heads of major corporations to Washington, D.C. to craft regulations governing pricing, wages, and other requirements that may affect whether or not a business could expand. Historian Burton Folsom Jr. gives the example of the tire industry, whose regulations were designed through the collusion of Goodyear, Goodrich, and Firestone. These giant tire companies were able to set prices for the entire industry, even having them enforced on local small business competitors and shops selling used tires. The price for tires was fixed artificially high because the large companies, having brand recognition throughout the country, could attract customers despite higher prices. Local shops survived by undercutting their competitors. Carl Ferris of the Ferris Tire and Rubber Company in Ohio, which had over 1,000 employees, is an example of how NIRA price fixing hurt the consumer, small businesses, and destroyed jobs to benefit large corporations. Up to 1933, his company survived by undercutting its giant competitors, but after NIRA, they were no longer legally allowed to sell less expensive tires. This nearly drove Ferris out of business, and had NIRA been allowed to continue, it's likely that his company would not have survived.
This was all an extension of FDR's prevailing vision at the time, that the problem with the economy was that salaries needed to be artificially increased in order to increase consumption of goods. Ideas that clearly did not work. Instead, these policies promoted the creation of cartels, allowing corporations to extract more wealth from the populace without needing to innovate or increase productivity at all because they did not need to compete. It may have raised the pay for the few lucky ones that actually had jobs, but it did nothing to expand the economic pie for all the rest of the population. It left the unemployed even worse off than they were before.
Since it is clear that the creation of the National Recovery Administration was modeled after fascism, it should be no surprise that this bureaucracy enforced its legislation in the same strong-armed manner that you would find under fascism as well. Supposedly, cooperation with NIRA was voluntary, and participating businesses got the government's Blue Eagle stamp of approval. When one even smaller tire manufacturer, F.H. Mills Jr., wrote to the NRA explaining that if his company complied with NRA pricing, it was impossible to stay in business, an NRA administrator named Frank Blodgett threatened to put his heel upon the neck of Mills's little company and twist it with all the force at his command. And in many cases, this is exactly what the National Recovery Administration did. Fred Perkins, who ran a battery shop, refused to comply with the NRA by raising wages because it would drive him out of business and cost his employees their jobs. Perkins was thrown in jail, where he ran his business from a jail cell, all while his employees came eagerly to his defense. Dry cleaners Sam and Rose Markowitz were jailed because they cleaned suits for 5 cents less than the legally mandated prices. Jacob Maged, a tailor, was also jailed when he refused to raise his prices, and he was also hit with a $100 fine. Henry Ford was probably the most notable American businessman who stood up to Hugh Johnson's administration. Ford, of course, is known for having paid his employees well above the market rates without a government mandate, but the NRA was attempting to compel him to raise the price of his cars to meet the regulations crafted by his competitors. In the case of Ford, who was too high profile to throw in prison, Johnson simply took lucrative government contracts elsewhere. In one contract for 500 trucks for FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps, Ford offered the lowest bid out of all of his competitors, but the government instead spent more taxpayer dollars with another company merely to punish Ford. This was no secret either. Roosevelt openly asserted a government boycott for the Ford Motor Company for not complying with the NRA agreement. It should be obvious to even the most pro-New Deal historians that mandating higher prices in the middle of a recession will hurt the consumer, and mandating higher wages will hurt unemployment. In fact, the Great Depression should have seen significantly more deflation following the liquidation of nearly half of the money supply in the United States. When money evaporates, prices and wages will adjust downward, and this is a necessary market phenomenon for markets to equilibrate. NIRA prevented this market equilibrium in such an obvious way that anybody with even an elementary understanding of economics should see quite clearly that this extended the Great Depression.
And this act was found unconstitutional just 2 years later.
The story of the Supreme Court case for NIRA is an interesting one. It came about due to the Schechter brothers, who sold kosher chickens in Brooklyn. Because they were being faced with the possibility of being fined or thrown in jail for violating NRA codes, they took a more proactive route than some of the previous examples and hired a legal team to defend them in court. Their case finally made it to the Supreme Court, and the NRA prosecutor accused the brothers of paying wages below the legal mandate, selling sick chickens, and, of all things, allowing their customers to choose what chicken they wanted to buy. The Schechter's lawyer, Joseph Heller, had to clarify the point repeatedly. He explained the NRA mandate, requiring that the customer not be permitted to select the chicken he wants, but instead, every customer must put his hand in the chicken coop when he buys from the slaughterhouse, and whichever chicken comes to his hand is the one he has to purchase. The transcript of the trial indicates that this explanation actually produced open laughter from the justices.
It's important, however, to note that even though the Supreme Court found this unconstitutional only 2 years later, enforcing that judgment remained the job of the executive branch, headed by FDR, who, not so surprisingly, entirely disagreed with the court's ruling. So for many years afterwards, such deals were still allowed and encouraged.
FDR was not happy about the Supreme Court throwing out his favorite piece of legislation, and following the ruling, he continued to pursue similar pieces of legislation in individual industries. One example was the Guffey-Snyder Act, which regulated the coal industry. It was a complicated piece of legislation which attempted to fix the price of coal based on so many factors that roughly 35,000 prices for coal had to be fixed. These complications led to significantly higher prices for coal and problems in running coal mining businesses that the industry declined so significantly there was talks of establishing a police state in Pennsylvania to completely regulate the trade of coal. FDR's court-packing scheme later would bring hopes of reestablishing the NRA. Roosevelt could never quite let go of his ideas for regulating the economy and even dreamed of having a global version of the NRA, establishing international cartels over which, according to Henry Morgenthau, Roosevelt would have complete power.
Because protection from antitrust prosecution was all but ensured, by 1934, nearly 80% of private, non-agricultural employment had entered into these collective agreements called for under NIRA. Cole and Ohanian calculate that NIRA and its aftermath account for 60% of the weak recovery. Without these policies, they conclude the Depression would have ended in 1936 rather than ending around 1943. But that's only 7 years of struggling. What difference does it make, right? In 19 key industries, the researchers had measured an average increase in prices of 23% above where they would have been given the state of the economy. With goods and services harder to afford, consumption actually declined and demand stalled. That's exactly the opposite of what FDR had hoped would happen, causing the gross national product to sink to 27% below where it otherwise would have been. As Ohanian stated, as we've seen in the past several years, salaries and prices fall when unemployment is high. By artificially inflating both, the New Deal policies short-circuited the market's self-correcting forces. And that's not all. As noted earlier, the National Industrial Recovery Act's labor provisions were strengthened by the National Relations Act signed into law in 1935. As a result, union membership doubled, and so did labor's bargaining power, rising from 14 million strike days in 1936 to about 28 million in 1937. By 1939, wages in these protected industries remained 24 to 33% above where the market would have naturally set them. Again, this was not happening because productivity was increasing. This wasn't happening because people actually deserved to get paid more. It was happening because companies were allowed to collude with each other and artificially set high prices for their goods and therefore also pay slightly higher wages. But again, that was coming at the expense of everybody else who was struggling to pay for these higher prices. Eventually, recovery came only after the Department of Justice dramatically stepped up its enforcement of these antitrust cases, nearly 4 times the rate found during the years where collusion was regrettably encouraged. Cole says the fact that the Depression dragged on for years convinced generations of economists and policymakers that capitalism could not be trusted to recover from depressions and that significant government intervention was required to achieve good outcomes. Ironically, Cole and Ohanian's work shows that the recovery would have been very rapid had the government just not intervened. This has been a production of We Are Capitalists. For more, find us on our page at facebook.com/We Are Capitalists. We're also available on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Podbean.com, YouTube, and Twitter at We Are Capitalists.